Some other things, get used to using commentaries. I don't use them a ton. I'll be completely candid with you. A lot of times I do use Gill, but that's pretty much it. I'm not a huge commentary guy. I know there's others who swear by them. As you work with commentaries, I just want to show you, this is BibleHub.com. If you have eSword or Blue Letter Bible or pretty much any Bible program, if you're lucky enough to have Logos, which I don't know that any of you do, but if you do, it's a nice program. But what these things are going to bring to the table is they're going to bring a lot of research that those other commentators have done. So Zach, I went and did some digging to find out who those Arabic sources were. And basically, if you look at the bottom of the commentary, he'll give you where he got the information. And so according to Gill, the Arabic sources go back to this guy by the name of George Almasin, which is the anglicized way of saying Hirhis al-Makin. But anyway, he's a Coptic Christian who was writing back in the 1200s. And he was quoting from other sources and potentially other sources that we don't have anymore. And so there's a bunch of Arabic things that go along with that. So Gill is quoting a guy from back in the 1200s who could have been quoting some people who predated him. And it goes all the way back there. He wrote a few books, actually a book in 2 parts. And the notes that I have here, it says, in the first half of the work, it's structured around a series of numbered biographies of the most important men of the times, with Adam as the first down to 586 BC, a history based on the Bible. Later data is based on various sources, some otherwise unknown to us. The first half ends with a list of patriarchs of the Church of Alexandria, and he basically is just commenting. So, bunch of Arabic stuff, and maybe interacted with Islam, but he's a Coptic Christian. So anyway, so that's where we can get some of that type of information. So that way you don't have to have the full compendium of books. And I'll just tell you, this is how I do research. There are times where I'll pull up a commentator like Gill. I'll go down to his footnote, and it'll have some random series of letters and numbers that I don't know what they mean. So I'll just highlight them, copy, paste. You paste it up in the search bar, and it'll bring up John Gill's commentary. And you're like, oh yeah, because that's the footnote in John Gill's commentary. And then you scroll down a little bit, and you'll typically find out who that guy is. Or, if you're lucky, Google Books, they will sometimes have a digital copy of it that you can access. So I sometimes will use things like archive.org or some of those other sources, and they will actually bring up old copies of books that you can download, and you can access public domain stuff. So anyway, this is what some of the commentary stuff is going to look like. So here's, one source here. I believe this is probably Gill that I'm looking at in this part. You got Benson's commentary here. You got Kiel and Delitzsch's here. This one up here, I know on the next page I have some other guy, but I don't know who this would be. But you can look here, you can see where the commentaries are going to come from different points of view. So in this one, you can see it's not unreasonable. The name belongs as the tradition of J evidently taught. And so these guys are coming from what type of theory? Since it has that little, the JEDP thing. So this guy, whoever writes this commentary, is coming from the JEDP theory and saying, oh, we agree with it, and so therefore this is. So just understand, as you're reading commentaries, you may start coming across little comments like that, and you're like, oh, I know where you're coming from then. Okay? Here's another shot of what commentaries are going to look like. So again, you bring it up on Bible Hub. You can show Genesis 4:26 is the one specifically I took a screenshot of. They called his name Enos, Hebrew, Enosh, that is man, and thus we find the language growing. Up until this time, there had been 2 names for man, Adam, which is and so now you're getting all these different perspectives on what that verse means, and so as you read, you can get a whole bunch of sources right there. Something else you can do, again, this is Bible Hub again, but you can look at it for a whole chapter and bring it up for a whole chapter and just read chunks of it.
Get invited to Liberty University.
Yeah, yeah, ads are fun. Okay, and then this is another one. So this is the joys of the YouTube search algorithm. So I searched Ken Ham, Sons of God, just to see what he had to say. Brings up Kent Hovind. Sure, because that Ken Ham. But what you're realizing, what you're seeing here, is the algorithm is saying, oh, you're searching something with Ken Ham. Oh, Ken Ham debated Bill Nye. So let's bring up Bill Nye, because obviously Ken Ham never said anything about sons of God. So you've got Ken Ham. Okay, we're going to bring up Kent Hovind, because he's a creation dude too. And he talked about sons of God. Okay, this is probably going to have nothing to do with the sons of God we're talking about, because that's a different, the Mormon views on it are a little different. As you guys are doing research, like I said, do the reading, but as you study it out, if something seems too good to be true, always check the other side to see what they say. If you find a fact that you're like, wow, that's really, really good, see if the other side has replied to it, and then you can kind of go back and forth and form your own debate in your mind. Now, as we move on, we are learning a little bit about the earth right before the flood. Okay, so we're kind of building up to Genesis chapter 6. Exodus chapter 12 is going to give us some insights, and the reason we go back to Exodus 12 is because this. A lot of times you hear that the earth is 6,000 years old, and the question arises, how do we know that? And really, it comes back to genealogies and various dates that the Bible gives us. So for instance, in Exodus chapter 12, we find out that Jacob arrives in Egypt 430 years before the Exodus. Okay? Now, depending on which text in the Bible you're looking at, that 430 years could be referring to Jacob, or it could be referring all the way back to Abraham. So just so you're aware of the debate here, that 430 years could be, because Paul will quote 430 years, and it seems like Paul is bringing it all the way back to Abraham rather than Jacob. So if that's the case, you're going to notice that the timeline is going to flex a little bit. Okay? Not by a whole ton, it might be about 200 years, but it's going to flex a little bit. So that's where there are times where we don't know exactly who a date is referring to, like we don't know where that thing anchors, but we have a fairly good guess. And so that's why when we say the earth is 6,000 years old, we're typically like, 6 to 10. We'll give you a 4,000 year buffer. You know, that's typically how we are figuring out the chronology. Now, how this works is we know that Jacob was 130 years old at that time, based on various passages in Genesis, etc. But if Jacob arrived 430 years before the Exodus, and he was 130 years old when he arrived, you can then backtrack another 130 years backwards. Okay? So basically it would be this idea. Of course I would bury my... There it is. I thought I had buried it under my pile of books. All right. So it's kind of like this. Like if we know this date right here, then we can go back 420 years, and then we can go back another 130 years. That's kind of what we're doing, because we know he was born here. He went into Egypt here. We know that the Exodus was here. And we know when the Exodus was because there's so many years up until Solomon's temple. All right, so the Bible is going to give us a lot of these hints. And so as you trace things back, you can start figuring out, like, if we know Solomon's temple was at this date, we backtrack it so many years and we get this date. We backtrack that so many years because of this fact, we get this date. Backtrack that because we know it's 130, we get that date. You see how that process works? Okay. We know that Joseph was 39 years old at that time. So we can, so at this point right here, when he comes down here, Joseph's 39. We can figure that out based on, how old he was when he went into Egypt, and then guessing a few things too. So we reverse engineer, so that means Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. Jacob was born in 2005 BC. That's when Isaac was 60. And so we can figure out that Isaac was 100 when Isaac was born. So Abraham was born in 2165 BC. And so basically what we're doing is we're taking what the Bible says about this guy lived so many years, had this kid, lived so many years, had this kid. This guy lived so many years and had that kid. And basically we're just backtracking by how old they were when they had that kid. And you can trace it back, and you can get to the point where, like, we can guesstimate, like, okay, Abraham could have been born in 2165. You kind of see how that works? You don't have to know all of those facts. It's just I'm showing you how this process works. So if Abraham was born here, he was 100 years old, so that means, 2265. If he was 60 years old, that's 2325. Boom, 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 boom. Keeps going on. All right. Now, before Abraham, we don't really have a lot of really solid numbers to play with, because it's not like Shem lived for so long and had this son, and so, we're not given some of that information. Before the flood, there's a ton of it. But after the flood, like between the flood and Abraham, we don't quite know, how long, for instance, was the Tower of Babel? At which point did that happen? We have some guesses. We have some other assumptions. Like I said, there's a few gaps in the genealogy where we're like, okay, it seemed to hop from father to grandson instead of father to son. So there seems to be some people missing. And as you can see, if Abraham can be 100 years old when he has a kid, how long was it between that guy and his son? Okay, so there's some of those questions that we don't necessarily have a full answer to. But if we put together a lot of the information, we can get a chart that looks roughly like this. Again, this is kind of a best guess scenario. Even here, as you can see, some of the dates might be slightly different, but this is pre-flood. So if we assume, based on Usher and other people and a few tweaks, if we assume creation was about 4100 BC, I know Usher's going to say like 4004, but the Septuagint, I'm just kidding. But Adam, okay, if he lives the 900 years or so, that's going to bring him to this date. Seth is born here. He's going to bring him to this date. Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Methuselah, Lamech. All right. And you can kind of see like Enoch, he's just kind of tucked in here because he was born back here to him, but he died after 360 years. Well, he didn't really die, but you know what I mean. All right. And then Noah is going to get born here. And so he's going to kind of be alive at the same time. So it's kind of crazy to think that like Noah just barely missed meeting Seth. Like just a few years off, which is kind of crazy to think, So it's like, so are you telling me that the first man's son just barely missed like his great, So it's kind of crazy to see some of this all put together. So Enosh would have still been alive for quite a while. Canaan would have still been alive for quite a while. Mahalalel, Jared, Methuselah. I mean, obviously it's grandfather, great-grandfather. Lamech. So you've got a lot of people who are still alive all the way up through here. Now, as we continue the chart over though, this is a little bit more stuff. So a lot of these guys probably would have been alive as Noah built the ark. So Noah's building the ark. We know based on various other passages when Shem was born. And so Shem is going to be here. I'll explain this in just a moment. So Shem is going to be alive obviously through the flood, but Shem's the one that we start seeing carry on various lines all the way down here to Abram. So that's why you suddenly see it go this way, because there's no more room to go that way. All right, so Shem is going to have Arphaxad and Shelah and Ebner and Peleg and Ru and Serug and Nahor and Terah and Abram. All right, lays it all out, but you can, what's fascinating is if we have our chronology right, then Abram would have been alive at the same time, potentially, as Shem. It's kind of crazy. So we lose track of that. But because we know how long Shem lived, and we know roughly, how the children panned out. So, anyway.
More been alive when Noah was alive?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he would have been alive then too. So, it's interesting. Again, we don't know exactly when the Tower of Babel fell. So we have something going on here. But again, Ham is going to live here. He's going to have Cush and Nimrod, some other children there as well that we'll talk about later. So they guesstimate, at least this chart guesstimates Tower of Babel to be about here. And so you can kind of see how that would play out. Now again, we're making some assumptions. I'm not saying that these dates are exactly correct, but I want you to see a picture of it to kind of get an idea of the fact that we lose track. Like if this guy really is living, 700 years, then he is going from before the flood all the way up potentially to Noah's day. Now, I'm not one who necessarily says that Shem is Melchizedek. That's their idea. There's a few ideas for why that is. doesn't really matter to our discussion at the moment. We may get into that when we get to Abram.
Melchizedek was king and priest, right?
Yeah, Melchizedek, again, it's one of those things where depending on where the word comes from, it's either Melchizedek or otherwise. The New Testament translates it for us and gives us an approximate meaning, but there could be potentially other meanings as well, based on what the root of the words are. So yeah, he's a priest and a king. He seems to be some sort of king of Salem. So whether he's the king of Jerusalem before it was called Jerusalem, like maybe it was just Shalem, maybe he's just a priest. That we don't know. So we'll talk about that. But there is a guy. What is his name? He's out of the 1800s, and he tried to trace like all paganism back to Babylon, and then he tried to say basically that Shem is mythologized in a lot of religions as like the guy who opposed the gods, because they claim Shem is this guy who came and like said, don't do this. It's an interesting thing. It's mostly debunked by now, but I'm wondering if that's where they got some of that. So the reason is, as you get into Melchizedek, the Bible talks about him having no father or mother, he's without generation. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that you're kind of like, so who is this guy? And so we'll get into that later.